National property prices have jumped 0.35% in September to a new record high, recovering all of the losses suffered last year. The PropTrack Home Price Index released today shows property prices have lifted every month this year. Joining me now is Angus, Economist with REA Group. Angus, property prices seem to have come roaring back pretty strongly.
Yeah, they certainly have, Ed. It's been a pretty remarkable year, actually. We saw prices fall pretty briskly through the back half of last year as the RBA was raising rates 50 basis points every month. We had expected that we'd continue to see downward pressure on prices this year just because of how far interest rates moved up last year. And that really hasn't been the case. Since December last year, prices nationally are up 4.3%. And as you say, have increased every single month, which is pretty remarkable recovery given where we're at.
Any cities in particular stand out to you?
Yeah, I think Sydney and Brisbane have been quite brisk in their recovery, but the real standouts are actually in Adelaide and Perth, both of which have been the fastest growing over the past year, and both more or less didn't see a downturn in prices as the RBA started raising rates.
We've got a chart we can put up showing the cumulative change in price since the pandemic. What's this explaining to us?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to take away from this chart. First, the thing that will really stand out is just how much prices increased across the pandemic, and in particular in 2021. The stat I always like to use here is 2021 was the third fastest year of growth nationally since 1880, so pre-Federation.
Wow.
So remarkably strong year. So
I'm amazed they had statistics back then.
It's hard to get them back that far, but it really highlights just how unusual 2021 was. But if we put that to one side, I think that the two things that stand out are, one, prices are basically back to peak in regional areas, and they're a little above peak where we were prior to the RBA raising rates in capital cities. Where that leaves us nationally is overall we're just above peak and crossed that this month. The other thing that stands out is just how strong regional areas were through the pandemic relative to capital cities. Both increased a lot, but regional areas especially.
We've got another chart we can put up showing Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, looking at the last couple of years here. Who's performing the best? Brisbane's obviously at the top red line there, but which city stands out? Yeah,
Brisbane obviously stands out as one of the strong performers across the pandemic, and it's really kind of not broken its stride this year. It obviously saw a downturn as the RBA was raising rates. You can see that on the chart there. But this year, things have kind of roared back in, and Brisbane's now well above where it was before the RBA started raising rates, about 2.5% above. So a pretty remarkable recovery. Sydney's in a similar boat, hasn't recovered quite as quickly, in part because it had a larger downturn than Brisbane. But as you can see on the chart, it has bounced back pretty strongly this year, and prices are now 0.03% below where they were before the RBA started raising rates, which I think between friends we can call basically back to peak.
Sure. But on that chart, it looks like Melbourne's been lagging. Why is that? Because it's obviously one of the best cities in Australia.
Yeah, look, it certainly has been a bit more sluggish. And that was true during the pandemic. It's been true this year as well. Like Sydney and Brisbane, it is recovering, but it has recovered more slowly. Prices are only up 0.2% in September compared to 0.5% in Sydney and in Brisbane 0.4%. So just not as strong a period of growth in Melbourne as we've seen in Sydney and Brisbane.
We've got another chart looking at some of the other capitals. Adelaide and Perth, it seems like they didn't experience a downturn at all.
Yeah, you're exactly right. They more or less didn't when the RBA started raising rates. Adelaide now, as you can see on this chart, has been an incredibly strong performing market across the last few years. It was strong during the pandemic, but it's remained strong even as interest rates have risen, and prices are up 8 to 9% in both Adelaide and Perth over the past year, which is pretty remarkable in the environment that we're in. Part of the story there is affordability. While prices have gone up a lot, they do remain more affordable markets than some of the other cities we've been talking about.
What about Hobart? Because on that chart, it seems to be on a downward trend.
Yeah, Hobart has been a pretty weak market since the RBA started raising rates, though it is important to put that in context. Hobart was the strongest performing market across the pandemic, and it's not shown on the chart here, but if you wind back even 2-3 years before that, it was also quite a strong performing city. What that means is Hobart's one of the least affordable parts of the country now. It's only just behind Sydney. And so that's starting to weigh on home prices, and it has been a pretty sluggish market as a result for the last sort of 12 months. It does look like things are stabilising. Prices were up very slightly in September, 0.1%, not a lot, but they've at least stopped falling, but definitely some weakness there.
And what's the outlook for prices over the rest of this year?
Yeah, it's a great question. Our expectation is we'll probably continue to see some price growth throughout the rest of this year, just given what we've seen so far this year. Heading into next year, a lot's going to depend on what happens to interest rates. At the moment, it looks like we're probably close to peak or potentially even at peak. If that changes, if interest rates have to go up by more because inflation is more persistent than we're expecting, that's obviously going to be a bit of a headwind, but really an unknown and one to watch next year. Yeah,
obviously the Reserve Bank meets on Tuesday. Are you expecting them to lift rates again this year, or is it unlikely?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm certainly not expecting them to raise at the meeting on Tuesday. Sure. I think that there's probably not a lot that they've seen in the past month that would change their view. I think there's a reasonable chance we'll see another 1 or 2 interest rate increases. Whether that's late this year, early next year, I think is an open question. But inflation does remain fairly high. There's some signs it's a bit persistent. And the labour market just remains really very strong. Unemployment is very low at the moment. And so in that environment, I think the RBA will feel there's a little bit more that they can do.
Yeah, I think one of the things the RBA has also been pretty worried about has been the high level of oil prices in the economy feeding through to the petrol pump as well. Angus Moore, we're out of time. Thanks so much for coming on the program.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ed.
So that's all for the show this Sunday. Up next, all the latest news right here on Sky News. Business Weekend returns next Sunday. But don't forget, you can keep up with all the latest business news with our daily program, Business Now, at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Thanks for your company. I'm Edward Boyd. We'll see you next week.
This program is brought to you by Real Estimate, Australia's #1 property value estimate. Get your real estimate today on realestate.com.au.